The restaurant was the kind of place people went when they wanted the comfort of a warm meal without the weight of a white tablecloth. Wooden tables, dim lights strung above, a steady hum of voices that filled the air without drowning out thought. In the corner, away from the bustle, Claire Jensen sat alone. She wore jeans and a faded gray sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose knot, a look that spoke of someone who wanted to blend into the background. There was no jewelry on her fingers, no gleam of a phone catching the light, just a plate of roasted chicken, a glass of water, and the steady rhythm of her fork moving from plate to mouth. She was beautiful, though not in the way that demanded attention. It was a quieter kind of beauty, clean lines of her face, a stillness in her eyes, the kind of presence you might miss until you found yourself glancing back a second time without meaning to. She didn't seem to belong to the noise around her. While other diners leaned into their conversations, laughter spilling out, Claire seemed anchored in her silence, content in it. At a table near the center of the room, three men had been laughing too loud for too long. Their drinks clinked hard, their voices cutting above the hum. One had the flushed look of someone who didn't know when to stop drinking. Another carried himself with the swagger of a man who thought every woman within 10 feet wanted him. And the third seemed to laugh at anything, even if he didn't understand the joke. They noticed her when one of them turned his head, his eyes catching on the solitary figure in the corner. "Look at that," he said, raising his glass. "Dinner for one. Shame to waste a table like that." His voice carried, deliberate, laced with the kind of confidence that counted on others laughing along. His friends did exactly that, smirking in her direction. Claire didn't look up. She cut another piece of chicken, chewed slowly, her eyes on the plate. The quietness of her reaction unsettled them more than if she'd snapped back. Indifference had a way of cutting deeper than insult. The waiter, a young man with nervous eyes, hovered close enough to hear. He glanced at Claire's table, then at the men, and stepped forward with a professional smile that was just a little too tight. "Gentlemen, let's keep it respectful, yeah?" His tone was low, careful, the voice of someone who'd seen this kind of thing escalate before. The man with the drink leaned back, his grin wide. "Just paying her a compliment," he said, though his tone made it clear no compliment was intended. The waiter looked to Claire, silently asking if she wanted him to intervene further. She shook her head once, a small, controlled gesture, her fork still moving. "It's fine," she said softly. Her voice was calm, even, not dismissive but final. The waiter hesitated, then stepped back, retreating toward the kitchen, but his eyes lingered with unease. At their table, the men shifted, their laughter lower now, sharper. "Oh, she's too good for us," one muttered, watching her. The other leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Nah, she's just shy. Give it a minute." Claire's fast didn't flicker. She kept eating, her movements steady, her focus unshaken. To anyone else, it might have looked like she hadn't even heard them, but the truth was different. She had heard every word, and she was waiting. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the kind of silence that unsettled rooms, the kind that grew heavier the longer it lasted. It was the quiet before a storm, though none of them realized it yet. For now, she just sat there, eating her meal, letting their words roll uselessly into the void she created around her. And that void was driving them mad. The scrape of a chair echoed across the room, sharp enough to cut through the chatter. One of the men rose from his table, his smirk plastered on like a mask he'd worn too many times before. He swaggered over, the kind of walk that drew eyes without earning respect. His friends followed close behind, one dragging his chair across the floor until it screeched, the other circling wide as though they were forming a net. Conversations around the restaurant faltered. Diners lowered their voices, but no one stood, no one spoke. Everyone just watched. The first man dropped into the empty seat across from Claire, leaning back like he owned it. He slapped his palm flat on the table, making the silverware jump. "Evening, sweetheart," he said, his grin wide, teeth flashing. "What's a pretty thing like you doing eating all by yourself?" His voice was pitched just loud enough to carry, and the laughter from his friends rolled out like an echo. The second man moved behind her, planting himself in the aisle. His chest puffed out, his arms crossed, he blocked any easy escape. The third leaned over, his hand dangling close to her plate, close enough that diners at other tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire didn't flinch. She set her fork down, her motions precise, unhurried, as if she were simply taking a break from her meal. Her eyes flicked up once, calm, steady, then dropped back to her plate. The silence stretched long enough to make their laughter falter. "Cat got your tongue?" the one seated asked, reaching forward suddenly. He plucked the fork she'd just set down, twirling it clumsily in his fingers. "Guess you don't need this." He stabbed a piece of food off her plate and shoved it into his mouth, chewing with exaggerated slowness, his eyes never leaving hers. His friends cackled, their voices carrying into every corner of the room. The second leaned closer from behind, his hand brushing her shoulder like he was testing the weight of her reaction. "You tense, honey? Relax, we're just having fun." Nearby, a couple shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man at the bar muttered something under his breath, but stayed rooted to his stool. The waiter reappeared in the doorway, frozen, his face pale with the knowledge that things were tipping. Still, Claire didn't move. She reached for her napkin, unfolded it with deliberate care, and set it down neatly beside her plate. Her hands folded once on top of it, her shoulders square, her breath measured and slow. Then she lifted her eyes, pinning each of them with a gaze so steady it cut through their noise. "I asked for dinner," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the room. "Not company. Walk away." For a moment, the laughter stalled. The one behind her let his hand fall back to his side. The man across the table blinked, then leaned forward, the fork still dangling from his hand. He snorted, shaking his head, the grin returning like a shield. "You hear that, boys?" he said, loud again, louder than before. "She thinks she's in charge." The third chuckled, tapping a fist against the table. "Cute," he said. "Real cute." The room seemed to hold its breath. Claire's face didn't change. She sat perfectly still, her eyes steady, her breath controlled. To them, her words had been nothing but a joke. To her, they had been something else entirely. Not a plea, not a warning, a countdown, and it had already begun. The fork clinked once against the plate, and then the room shifted. Claire moved so fast the air seemed to lag behind her. Her chair slid back without a sound, gliding across the floor as though guided by intention alone. In one fluid motion she rose, her body folding low, weight balanced perfectly on the balls of her feet. The man across from her barely had time to sneer before her hand snapped forward, catching his wrist mid-spin of her stolen fork. She twisted once, sharp and exact, and his grin collapsed into a howl as his arm buckled. With the same momentum, she slammed his face into the table. The wood rattled with the impact, silverware bouncing, glasses spilling. His nose crunched against the plate he'd mocked, and he slumped forward, groaning, blood streaking across the half-eaten meal. Gasps rippled through the restaurant, chairs squeaking as people shifted back, caught between shock and fascination. The second man, the one who had brushed her shoulder, moved to grab her from behind, but Claire was already turning. She drove an elbow into his ribs with the kind of force that made the air leave his lungs in a single guttural grunt. His knees buckled, and before he could even bend to recover, she swept his legs out from under him with a precision strike, her boot hooking behind his ankle. He hit the floor with a heavy thud, hands clawing at the ground as he tried to pull in breath that wouldn't come. The third man roared, his bravado flaring into panic. He lunged, his larger frame crashing toward her, hands outstretched to pin her down by sheer weight. Claire pivoted on one foot, her body sliding past him with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times in shadows where no one had been watching. As he barreled by, her hand shot up, striking the side of his neck, a precise blow that jolted his body sideways. She caught him in that falter, her arm snaking around his throat. One twist, one pull, and his momentum turned against him. His body jerked, stiffened, and then collapsed, his breath choked out in seconds. It was over before the room could catch up. 15 seconds, no more. 3 men sprawled across the restaurant floor, one slumped over a table bleeding, another writhing and gasping for breath, the third, unconscious in a heap at her feet. The clatter of dropped utensils broke the silence, forks and knives falling from frozen hands. Diners stared wide-eyed, some covering their mouths, others sitting rigid, forks still hovering midair as though they had been turned to stone. Claire stood in the middle of it all, her breathing calm, her posture relaxed. She adjusted her sweater once, pulling it back into place, her movements unhurried. Not a bead of sweat traced her skin. Not a single strand of hair had slipped from the knot at the back of her head. Her eyes scanned the room once, steady, unflinching, and every gaze that met hers flicked away instantly. Her movements hadn't been wild or desperate. There had been no wasted flailing, no reckless fury. What they had witnessed was something surgical, each strike calculated, each step flowing into the next with a discipline that left no room for error. This wasn't a brawl. It wasn't a bar fight. It was a demonstration, the kind of violence that belonged to training few had ever seen up close. The restaurant was silent now, but for the ragged wheeze of the men she had dropped. Somewhere near the back, a glass toppled over and shattered, and the sound made half the diners flinch. Claire didn't move. She simply lowered herself back into her chair, sliding it in with the same quiet control with which she had risen. She picked up her napkin, wiped a faint smear of blood from her hand, and set it neatly back in her lap. Then she reached for her water glass, lifting it with steady fingers. To anyone watching, it looked less like a woman who had just fought off 3 men and more like someone resuming her dinner after a small interruption. That composure was what froze the room more than the violence itself. Anyone could lash out in panic. Only someone trained, deeply trained, could end a fight in seconds and sit back down as if it were nothing at all. Around her, people whispered the words they couldn't quite say aloud. SEAL. Special Forces. Something dangerous. Something untouchable. And Claire let them think what they wanted, sipping her water, calm as stone, as the wreckage of 15 seconds lay groaning at her feet. The room was still vibrating from what had just happened, but Claire moved as though none of it had touched her. The waiter, his hands trembling around the notepad he hadn't even used, stumbled forward a few steps, his voice caught between awe and fear. "Ma'am, how what? What was that?" His words cracked, the syllables tumbling over each other like he couldn't quite convince himself they were real. His eyes darted to the 3 men on the floor, sprawled and broken, then back to her, searching for something human in the calm that clung to her like a second skin. Claire didn't answer. She adjusted her jacket, smoothing it over her shoulders where the fabric had twisted during the fight. She slid her chair back toward the table, the legs gliding noiselessly across the floor, and lowered herself into her seat with unhurried grace. Her napkin was folded neatly again, her fork resting in its proper place beside her plate. She picked it up as though nothing had happened, as though the men groaning on the ground were no more than a draft at the window. She cut into what remained of her meal, brought a bite to her mouth, and chewed, her gaze steady on the plate before her. The silence pressed against the walls of the restaurant. Conversations that had once filled the room with warmth and noise now lay dead on the floor alongside the fallen men. Diners sat stiff in their seats, forks hovering midair, half-finished glasses of wine untouched. Every eye watched her, but no one dared speak. It was the man at the bar who finally moved. He had been still through the entire ordeal, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Now he pushed the drink aside and rose. Slowly, deliberately. His age showed in the gray that swept through his hair, but not in his posture. The way he straightened his shoulders carried the weight of discipline, of years spent standing at attention in far harsher places than this. He walked forward a single step, his boots clicking against the wood floor, and then he stopped. His hand rose, sharp and precise, fingers to brow. Not a nod. Not a gesture of thanks. A soldier's salute. The air shifted with it. A murmur rolled across the tables like a tide no one could stop. That's SEAL training. Only SEALs move like that. The words passed from table to table, whispered with disbelief, with awe, until they weren't whispers at all but a low hum of recognition. People leaned closer, their eyes wide, their voices quick. She's military, has to be. Did you see that choke? Did you see the precision? SEAL, no question. Claire set her fork down gently, dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, and looked toward the waiter, who still stood frozen a few feet away. Her voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried across the room with clarity. Check, please. No explanation, no confirmation, no denial, just those words, spoken like a line drawn in the sand. The three men on the ground groaned, their laughter gone, their arrogance stripped bare. One clutched his ribs, wheezing, another pressed his sleeve to his bloodied nose. The third stirred faintly, not yet fully conscious. They had come to the table thinking they'd found prey. Instead, they'd been dismantled by the woman who now sat quietly finishing her meal. No one in the restaurant would ever forget the sight. Not because of the speed of her hands or the violence of her strikes, but because of what came after the way she had sat back down. Calm as stone, her silence louder than any shout could have been. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to prove a thing.